Welcome to episode 21 of Islam in the Contemporary World, a new narrative. What if the Caliphate wasn't the divine political model many believe it to be? Today, Zafarullah Khan unpacks the historical reality, Quranic insight, and modern alternatives that reshape how Muslims should understand unity, power, and purpose in our globalized age. So we're jumping straight into some source material that, well, it starts with a really direct observation about the state of the Muslim world today. It doesn't really shy away from pointing out challenges like exploitation, poverty.
And even the use of Islam for terror.
Exactly. Suggesting this stems at least partly from Muslims being, quote, stuck to the past.
It's quite a challenging assessment right off the bat, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's acknowledging a difficult reality. This perspective seems to argue that a key issue is maybe a lack of real ijtihad.
That process of independent reasoning.
Right, that interpretation in Islamic law that lets you adapt to new contexts.
Yeah.
The source calls for a kind of reawakening, you could say.
Okay, let's really dig into this then. Our mission in this deep dive is to explore the core arguments laid out here, focusing specifically on how it re-examines these key concepts. The Caliphate, or Khilafat, the notion of Muslim unity, the Ummah, and what valid political models might actually look like today in the modern world.
Yeah, and the big question sort of driving the analysis is a universal caliphate something specifically commanded, divinely?
Yeah.
Or is it more a product of history, political evolution?
And what difference does that distinction make for Muslims right now? That's the key.
Exactly. So to get there, this perspective first takes us back to the fundamental terms, Khilafat or Caliphate. It comes from the Arabic word Khalifa.
Which means successor or ruler.
Successor, or often vicegerent or representative. Historically, it became the term for the ruler of the Muslim community.
And the source points out that this term Khalifa, it actually shows up in the Quran in a few really interesting ways.
It does. Think about the story of Adam. When Allah speaks to the angels, the Quran says something like, "Behold, thy Lord said to the angels, I will create a vicegerent on earth."
Right. And the angels are concerned, aren't they? About mischief and bloodshed.
They are. But Allah's response is, essentially, I know what you don't know. It puts Adam in this really significant role, a vicegerent of God on earth. That's Quran 2.30.
Okay. Then it's also used for the prophet David.
Yeah, specifically for David. Oh, David, we did indeed make thee a vicegerent on earth. So judge thou between men in truth and justice. That's Quran 38.26.
So it connects being a vice-regent directly to judging fairly.
Yeah.
Governance.
Precisely. Connects vicegerency to the responsibility of just governance. And the material also brings up another verse, Quran 24.55, about believers being granted authority.
The one about inheritance of power.
That's it. Allah has promised to those among you who believe and work righteous deeds that he will grant them in the land inheritance of power. It talks about believers collectively having this role, establishing divine principles.
So, the Quran uses Khalifa for individuals like Adam and David, talks about believers collectively getting authority. But the source notes that some Muslim scholars look at these and argue for, what? One single caliphate for everyone.
For the entire Muslim Ummah worldwide, yeah. That's the interpretation some scholars derive.
Which brings us right to that second key term, Ummah.
Ummah, Arabic for the people, often used, yes, for the community of Muslims sharing that common ideology. But interestingly, it can also just mean a general community of peoples.
Well, the Quran definitely talks about Muslims as a collective. Like in 3.110, ye are the best of peoples, evolved for mankind. That sounds pretty specific.
It does sound specific, but here's where the historical evidence this material presents gets really fascinating. It points to the Constitution of Medina.
The Misaki Medina from 622 AD.
Exactly. The agreement Prophet Muhammad negotiated with everyone in Medina, Jewish tribes, Christians, pagans, the lot. And crucially, this document, this historical charter, explicitly called these non-Muslim citizens members of one ummah.
Wow, okay. So ummah, back then, could define a multi-religious political community, not just the global Muslim population, bound by a social contract.
That's the argument this source makes, based on that historical usage. It shows a broader, more inclusive application of the term historically.
So, combining that historical use of ummah with the Quranic context for Khalifa, which emphasizes being a vicegerent, ruling justly, but doesn't explicitly command one universal political structure,
leads to the material's central argument that the Holy Quran does not actually command the establishment of a universal single caliphate.
Instead, it's presented as a political construct.
A political construct, something that arose and evolved as a product of history.
Okay, so the argument isn't denying that Muslims are meant to be caliphs, vicegerents following God's commands. It's questioning the required political form for doing that.
Exactly. The idea presented is that when Muslims gain governance somewhere, they should follow divine instructions, yes, but within the political structures that are available, according to the spirit of the time.
According to the spirit of the time. That phrase seems pretty important when we look at how politics has changed, especially with the rise of the modern nation-state.
Absolutely critical. This material explains that the nation-state isn't some timeless concept. It's a product of evolving political thought, evolving practice, and it really started to solidify after the Peace of Westphalia in 1648.
Ah, Westphalia. I remember learning about that. The source describes it as a major turning point, right? After all those brutal religious wars in Europe.
Decades of them, like the 30 Years' War. Westphalia basically led to the final breakup of older unifying structures like the Holy Roman Empire. It shattered that previous idea of Europe having one spiritual and temporal unity under a single authority.
And what came out of that fragmentation?
Independent, sovereign states. The nation-state, as this material defines it. A political entity getting its legitimacy from representing a sovereign nation within defined borders. Centrally controlled, independent, recognizing each other's sovereignty.
Which is a huge shift from older models, like empires.
A massive shift. And this development, the source notes, was also fueled by new ideas. Political economy, capitalism, mercantilism, that sort of thing. It contrasts sharply with how older empires worked, including historical Muslim empires, which were often these vast, multi-ethnic territories under one ruler.
Okay, so this historical context of the nation-state sets the stage for looking at the actual historical experience of Muslims, politically speaking. How does that reality stack up against the ideal of a single, perpetual, universal caliphate?
Right, and the material starts that comparison right back at the beginning.
Yeah.
Prophet Muhammad established the city-state of Medina.
With that multi-religious charter in 622 declaring everyone one ummah.
Yes. Then, after his death, that city-state evolved into the Caliphate Rashida, the period of the first four rightly guided caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali, from 632 to 661 AD.
A period held in very high regard, especially by Sunni.
Extremely high regard. But this analysis doesn't gloss over the problems even then. It details the protests against the third caliph, Uthman.
He refused to use force against the protesters, right? Trying to avoid bloodshed.
He did. But tragically, as the source recounts, protesters eventually broke into his home and assassinated him while he was reciting the Quran. That was in 656.
And that just triggered chaos.
Utter chaos. A devastating civil war. The conflict between Ali, the fourth caliph, and Muawiyah, the governor of Syria, it involved really prominent figures, senior companions of the Prophet.
Leading to huge battles.
Massive battles. The material mentions the Battle of Jamal in 656 involving Aisha, Talha, Zubair, huge names. Thousands died, maybe 10,000 estimated.
And then Siffin.
The Battle of Siffin in 657. Even worse casualties estimated there may be 25,000 on Ali's side, 45,000 on Muawiyah's. The source argues these conflicts created a permanent rift between the Sunnis and the Shias, spawned groups like the Khawarij, and basically destroyed the political unity of Muslims once for all in that very early stage.
So if that unity fractured so early, what does that mean for the idea of a continuous single caliphate ruling everyone?
Well, the material's argument, based on this history, is that the evidence just doesn't support it after those initial few decades. It states very clearly, there was no one monolithic Muslim-Islamic caliphate after the Caliphate Rashida.
Meaning no single political power covering the whole Muslim world.
Exactly. No universal caliphate with both temporal and political unity over all Muslims.
And this perspective really hammers that point home by, what? Listing all the different Muslim states that existed.
Yeah, it provides this extensive list, different caliphates, sultanates, empires popping up all over the place at different times. Europe, Russia, the Middle East, Central Asia, Africa, Spain, South Asia, Southeast Asia.
That's quite a list.
It is. And the point isn't just a history lesson. It's presented as concrete evidence of the historical reality, which was political multiplicity, diversity of states, not monolithic unity after that initial period.
Okay, so bringing that historical picture forward combined with, the way the world is now.
And the analysis concludes that trying to establish a single universal Muslim caliphate today is, and I quote again, an unrealizable romantic notion.
Strong words. Does it give any modern examples of why it's considered unrealizable?
It gives a very stark one. The Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s.
Right after the Islamic Revolution in Iran.
Exactly. You had the establishment of the Islamic Republic in Iran in 1979, and then almost immediately, this horrific war breaks out between two Muslim-majority nations. Hundreds of thousands died.
A modern echo of those early civil wars.
That's the connection this perspective draws. It uses this tragic modern example alongside the history to pose some really pointed questions. Questions like, can a Shia accept a Sunni Khalifa?
Yeah.
Can Sunnis accept a Shia Khalifa?
Or even on national lines.
Yes. Could a Bangladeshi Muslim accept a Pakistani Khalifa? These questions really cut to the core of the issue, don't they? They highlight the real existing political, sectarian, national ethnic divisions within the Muslim world today.
Which makes the idea of one single leader everyone would agree on seem, well, extremely difficult, if not impossible, as the source suggests.
Pretty much. So if that single universal caliphate is off the table as an unrealizable romantic notion, what are the alternatives? How can Muslims strive for unity or cooperation?
Does the source offer any ideas?
It does. It suggests exploring concepts like a commonwealth of Muslim states, maybe strengthening existing bodies like the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Conference.
Okay, cooperation between existing states. What about thinkers? Does it mention anyone?
It brings in Muhammad Iqbal, often called the sage of modern Islam. According to this material, Iqbal thought about this whole idea of a universal imamat, or caliphate. He looked at the different views. Was it divinely ordered? Was it just practically useful? Or maybe not needed at all?
And what was Iqbal's take, according to this source?
Well, the source suggests that some, like modern Turkey perhaps, moved towards seeing it as a matter of expediency, realizing the universal idea hadn't really worked since the old empires broke up and independent states emerged. But Iqbal's own vision, as presented here, was quite different.
How so?
He argued that maybe every Muslim nation must sink into her own deeper self, temporarily focus her vision on herself alone until all are strong and powerful.
Strong individually first.
Yes, strong individually. Then they can form a living family of republics. That was his phrase.
A living family of republics.
Like
That's
united.
different. So unity comes not from one ruler, but from cooperation between strong independent units.
Exactly. As Iqbal put it, true unity is found in a multiplicity of free independent units whose racial rivalries are adjusted and harmonized by the unifying bond of a common spiritual aspiration.
So the spiritual bond is key, but the political structure is multiple independent states.
That's the vision. He even said Islam is ultimately neither nationalism nor imperialism, but a league of nations which recognizes artificial boundaries and racial distinctions for facility of reference only.
A League of Nations model. Interesting. Does the source point to any real-world examples that might fit this kind of thinking? Like independent states trying to be both modern and Islamic?
It does. It points specifically to Pakistan's Objectives Resolution of 1949. It presents this as a significant step forward,
How so?
as not just copying a Western model, but creating something rooted in both Islamic ideology and democratic principles for a modern nation-state.
What were the key points of that resolution?
Well, the source highlights several. It declared sovereignty belongs ultimately to Allah, right? But the authority to govern is delegated to the state through the people as a sacred trust.
Okay, so popular sovereignty within a divine framework.
Kinda, yeah. State power exercised by chosen representatives.
Okay.
And it mandated upholding principles like democracy, freedom, equality, tolerance, social justice, but specifically as enunciated by Islam.
And what about religious practice?
It explicitly required enabling Muslims to live according to the Quran and Sunnah. But also, crucially, making adequate provision for minorities to freely practice their own religions and cultures, plus guarantees for fundamental rights, independent judiciary, the whole package.
And this had support from religious scholars at the time.
That's what the source emphasizes. It says leading Islamic scholars like Maududi, Usmani, the peer of Manki Sharif supported it, and it represents a kind of consensus. A collective ijtihad, that reasoning process, again, accepting the concept of the nation-state of Pakistan, but grounding it in Islamic principles.
So the Objectives Resolution is presented here as concrete evidence, a real-world attempt to create a modern, independent political entity that is still fundamentally rooted in Islamic values and deliberation, a path distinct from aiming for a single universal caliphate.
Exactly. It's offered as an example of how Muslims have navigated this, establishing a nation-state that strives to embody Islamic principles through collective effort.
Okay, let's try to pull this all together. We've really unpacked this perspective, starting with the historical context of Caliphate, the potentially broader meaning of Ummah we saw in that Medina example.
Right.
And then the core argument from this source, that a universal caliphate isn't presented as a direct divine command for all time, but more as a political form, and one that, based on the history laid out here, hasn't really existed as one single entity since the very, very early days.
We looked at the evidence presented for that historical disunity, the rise of many different Muslim political centers. We grappled with those tough questions about why a universal caliphate is seen as unrealistic today, the sectarian, the national divisions.
Yeah, those are hard questions.
They are. And then we explored the alternatives discussed in the material, things like a commonwealth or Iqbal's really interesting vision of a League of Nations of independent republics, bound spiritually.
And finally, that example of Pakistan's objectives resolution, presented as a modern attempt at an Islamically informed independent political structure.
It really forces a rethink, doesn't it, about how Muslims might approach political unity and purpose in today's world.
It certainly does, and it leaves us with a pretty provocative thought to mull over directly from this analysis. Given the historical reality, all those different Muslim states over centuries and the divisions that still exist, can that deep aspiration for global Muslim unity realistically be achieved through trying to recreate a single political structure? Or, as this perspective suggests, does the path forward actually lie more in the cooperation, the collaboration between independent, Islamically conscious nation states